Okay, here's our second authorial intent focus on Stasiland and Anafunda. And what this one's about really is about what is revealed through Funda's description of the people she interviews and the people she observes in regards to her intended purpose for writing. So it's my contention that what Funda is attempting to argue is that if the pre-GDR made people kind of insane, and it was a form of insanity to accept dictator logic and surveillance and propaganda and all that entails, then post-GDR still suffers the aftermath of that kind of psychological malaise. So let's have a look at how that is demonstrated. So the first thing I want you to do is to consider the references to the people in the park. So it's these observations that Funda makes as she goes to and from her work, as she encounters people in their various kind of daily activities, that we can get some really crucial information about what she's saying about the GDR and how even after the fall of the wall, some 7 years later in 1996, when she's investigating these personal stories, she's seeing evidence of some quite bizarre behaviour and the remnants of the old regime still very much intact. So I've just grouped this information here and called it the people in the park. And this is going to be useful because it also helps you to understand her purpose for trying to reconcile the sense of chaos that she sees at the beginning of her investigation with what she's hoping is some kind of movement forward at the end when she returns in 2000. And so we see that we've got the people in the park on page 88, and then we've got the people in the park on page 282. And I think the difference in the way that the people in the park are represented and described reveals her purpose in attempting to bring closure not only to her investigation, but closure to the story that is the history of the GDR, and therefore finishing on a note of hope and suggesting that there can be a transition into the future that is optimistic. So let's have a look then on page 88. We've got Anna catching the underground to Rossenthaler Platz, and she's walking home through the park. There's references to pensioners. The park belongs to the drunks and the punks. We've got references to daggy old kind of tracksuits and business suits that seem pretty archaic and old-fashioned. The people are depicted as shuffling together in an amphitheatre arrangement around the statue of Hine. All day long they hold what look like philosophical discussions, gesticulating slowly with their free hands. Then later on we've got young people, just a paragraph later, who have as much beer and as many cigarettes as the drunks, but a lot more rancour. I guess they're angry people. There are fights and tears, terrible pain, public in the park. Sometimes they ask for money, unlike the drunks who claim the benches and tram shelters. The young people sit or sleep on the ground. So there's a sense of disorder and of fragmentation, of a lack of unity, of people being purposeless and unsupported. That's the kind of image we get of post-GDR life for many inhabitants that Funda is referencing there. So then if we turn to page 282, we have quite a different descriptive reference to the people in the park. And thank you very much, Jessie, for pointing this out to me. So the last page of the narrative concludes with her walking home once more back to her apartment from Rossenthaler Platz station. This time it's spring 2000. Okay, we've come 4 years. So we've moved forward 4 years or 3.5 years, and the park is alive. The light's so bright it picks out people and their shadows is exaggerated 3D, in exaggerated 3D. Sunbathers loll on the grass, some in trunks and some bare bottom. There are teenagers removing gum from their mouths to kiss, a sheepdog with a single forelock, dyed green, an adolescent cripple in a baby pusher being taken for a stroll. People shake infants up and down to make them calm, and children spin on swings and roundabouts I never noticed were there. So that's worthy of consideration. So I'm going to quickly move on and talk about Julia Beren because my 10 minutes will be up. So again, we're going back to that whole idea that there is a sense of things being quite abnormal post-GDR, of people still suffering from the residual impact of a regime that controlled people's lives. So with the description of Julia on page 90, we've got a reference to honesty and transparency, of openness in describing the people, but there is, as we know, reference to Miriam and her retreat from intimacy. So on the one hand, there seems to be an openness to presenting information that's truthful and factual. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of concealment in terms of trying to deceive or lie, but there's an unwillingness, really. Julia has no story. It takes some prompting for Anna to get the story out of Julia. And she even talks about the fact that she's not sure if she remembers the story accurately because, as Funda surmises, it's probably a story that she hasn't gone over in her head very much at all. So that's quite revealing in terms of the way that Funda comes to some conclusions about Julia based on what she wears and how she kind of behaves. She's also wearing the colours of the former GDR, so red, black and gold, a weird kind of salute to patriotism and nationalism. And this is a woman who has been victimised by the regime. So we've got that kind of double-edged acknowledgement that even for those who resist the regime and who are certainly against the regime, there's this kind of weird loyalty and allegiance to it as well. So we have little references such as Julia's claim that there were no drunks before the wall came down. Julia said, I mean, in the park, no one was homeless as they are now. So there's kind of a defence of the former GDR and that comparison between what has happened since it's been westernised and what it was like pre its westernisation. So there's lots of references to that. Hagen Kosh is an interesting one. I won't read the quote, but if you can just sort of have a look here. The chapter begins with socialist man. So he was cultivated as a believer, and so he grew up believing in the system because that was what was pushed on him as a child. So he's a key cartographer for the erection of the Berlin Wall, and he is victimised by the regime. And in the end, he gets out of the Stasi and is able to leave and joins the regular army. But on page 256, we've got a reference to him now conducting tours of the wall. So there's this whole kind of observation that Funda makes about the illogical nature of the behaviour of many of these victims or victims perpetrators, victims, Stasi operatives, whatever, who, in spite of their mistreatment, defend the system, defend the Stasi, defend their former country from criticism. So get your head around that. So that's on page 257. Herr Koch is pleased to be with someone who shares his interest in the wall. He is also perhaps even more obsessed with it than I remember. He seems to have lost the awareness that his is a particular interest. He is once more a true believer. The wall is the thing that defined him, and he will not let it go. I think for a moment of Frau Paul, who will also not let it go. Her Koch starts to take photos. I look up at the angel's long face and I think of Miriam and Julia, lives shaped too by the wall. Will they let it go, or will it let them go? Okay, what else have we got? We've got Frau Paul and her kind of distorted memories. That's another interesting observation on Funda's part in terms of the reliability of memory. I might skip straight down to von Schnitzler because he's probably the most obvious example of somebody who's